Hello, everyone. My name is Logan Hicks. Welcome to the Hawaii Department of Transportation's 2023 Protect Our Water Conference. I'll be your moderator for this session, your in-person moderator. This one is titled the USACE Honolulu District Regulatory Program Overview. This session is also being streamed concurrently on our virtual conference platform. So at the end of the presentation, the speaker will have a few minutes to answer your questions. If any virtual attendees have questions, please use the Q&A feature during the presentation to ask any questions you may have. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the speaker. We have Vera Koskelo here. She is a regulatory project manager and has been with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers since 2008. Since joining the Honolulu District in 2015, Vera has reviewed applications for a variety of projects, including aquaculture, beach nourishment, and stream maintenance, and is dedicated to helping applicants, consultants, and the public understand the core regulatory process. Vera also serves as the Honolulu District Public Involvement Specialist, a role that involves facilitating, advising, and assisting Corps of Engineers staff across the U.S. with planning for and conducting public engagement. Vera is part of the Hawaii Silver Jackets team, an interagency team that facilitates collaborative solutions to state flood risk priorities. During the recent detail with the Honolulu District's Civil and Public Works branch, Vera wrote the Honolulu District's Supplemental Environmental Justice Strategic Plans for Climate Resilience in Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa. So please help me in welcoming Vera Koskelo. Good morning, Vera.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Vera. I am a project manager with the Honolulu District Regulatory Office, and today I'll be providing an overview of our regulatory program. So a little bit of what we're going to cover today. I'll start with some of the basics, the core regulatory mission and our authorities. Then I'll get into our geographic jurisdiction, followed by our permitting process and some of the activities that we permit. Then I'll get into everybody's favorite, when is a permit not required, and followed by some other updates as far as non-reporting nationwides and the Section 401 blanket. And we'll wrap up with some keys to a good application. The regulatory mission is to protect the nation's aquatic resources while allowing reasonable development through fair, flexible, and balanced permit decisions. So what do? We review Department of the Army Corps permit applications for certain activities in waters of the U.S. And so when we receive your application, the two hemispheres that you're seeing in yellow and blue are sort of the twin considerations that we're evaluating your proposal in regards to. The activity-based jurisdiction, is this a regulated activity? And geographic-based jurisdiction, is this within the Corps' jurisdiction? Is this a water of the U.S.? And if it is both, and assuming that there's not an exemption that applies, then you'll need a Corps permit. So our two main authorities that give the Corps the authority to review and applications and issue permits are Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, the Corps reviews applications for structures in and work in, over, or under a navigable waterway. And when we're talking about navigable, it doesn't necessarily have to be navigable. In fact, in the Honolulu District, we treat the waters that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide as navigable waters when we're thinking about Section 10. And the purpose of this authority is to maintain navigation. Under Section 404, the Corps regulates the discharge of dredged or fill material into all waters of the U.S. That's both the ones that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide and ones that are non-tidal. And this also includes wetlands. And the purpose is to protect aquatic resources from Mauka to Makai. So when we're talking about geographic jurisdiction, what are we talking about here? So we have different limits depending on whether we're talking about tidally influenced waters versus non-tidal. So let's start with tidally influenced on the left-hand side. So this would be like, say, like the Pacific Ocean. We have two different geographic jurisdiction limits depending on whether your activity is Section 404, the discharge of fill, that's the top line. And if you follow that down to where it meets that sort of sand dune in the middle. You can see the little arrow in the middle points to the high tide line. So that is not a NOAA datum. So when you're coming into what is the high tide line, you can either use on-site characteristics like a rack line or some other sort of debris or scum along the shoreline to identify that high tide line, or the Honolulu district is willing to accept the NOAA datum, the mean high water mark, as a proxy for the high tide line. For section 10, so that's structures and works, that would be like a dock or dredging, the limits of the Corps' jurisdiction in a tidal system. So that's the inner section on the left-hand side, follow that down, and underneath that's the mean high water line. So that can, again, be identified on-site based on on-site characteristics, or that is a NOAA datum. In non-tidal environments, we're going to move to the right-hand side of this figure. So for waters, like streams, the Corps' limit of jurisdiction is the ordinary high water mark. And for wetlands, it's the boundary of the wetlands. So hot off the presses, very exciting. There's a new definition of waters of the US. So, and you might have seen some of the maps online that different states are following some different definitions. So here in the Honolulu district, we're following the amended January 2023 rule. This is effective as of September 8, 2023. And one key difference from where we were before with the outcome of the Rapanos and Carabel court cases is the removal of the significant nexus standard. Instead, it's solely focused on the Scalia plurality opinion from Rapanos, the 2006 court case. And so, in a summary, waters of the US include relatively permanent, standing or continuously flowing bodies of water forming geographic features that are described in ordinary parlance as streams, oceans, rivers, and lakes, and adjacent wetlands. So if you were sort of following along before and we had that difference between adjacent versus abutting, for those folks at home, adjacent was sort of nearby but somehow connected, and abutting meant touching. Now all adjacent means is touching, having a continuous surface connection to water of the US. So I know this is new and folks are likely to have a lot of questions. I can't promise that I'm going to be able to answer those today. And so I would recommend if you could write those down and submit them to us at the end of this presentation. I'll have our email, or if you've got a copy of our brochure, our office email is on the front, and go ahead and send them over to us and we can discuss them with a little bit more time to marinate. If you're looking to dig in a little bit more on your own, do some more reading up, these are the EPA, the website to follow up, as well as the EPA email that you can follow up and ask some questions. So again, big picture on now what is a water of the US. There are 5 main categories. There's the A1, which includes TNWs, the traditional navigable waters, territorial seas, and interstate waters. A2, impoundments of jurisdictional waters. A3, tributaries. A4, adjacent wetlands. And A5, intrastate lakes and ponds that don't fall into those other 4 categories. This is something that's been continuous a little bit, but what is not considered a water of the US? Waste treatment systems, prior converted cropland, certain ditches, artificially irrigated areas, certain artificial lakes and ponds, pools or ornamental pools, water-filled depressions created in dry land, and swales and erosional features. So shifting sort of from the blue hemisphere about core geographic jurisdiction, now we're going to shift to the yellow as far as regulated activities. So there, let's say you fall in the middle, you're that green where it's within the Corps' geographic jurisdiction, it's a regulated activity. Now you're going to need a permit. What kind of permits? What are we talking about with permits here? So the Corps has 2 main types, general permits and individual permits. So in other parts of the country, there are other types of general permits. You can have regional general permits or state programmatic general permits or other programmatic general permits. At this point in the Honolulu district, we only have nationwide permits. There is the application form, is ENG form 6082. I think the one that is most commonly available is, it says it's expired, but we'll work with that as still valid. What are you supposed to do if there's not a more current version? And the core processing time, once we receive a complete PCN, pre-construction notification, which is what the application's called for the nationwides, is about 60 days. Individual permits, there's two subcategories. There's standard permits or letters of permission. So letters of permission are section 10 only, structures and work in tidally influenced waters, for projects that for whatever reason didn't fit the nationwide permit program, but still have relatively minor impacts, versus standard permits kind of cover everything else, section 10 and 404. The permit application is called ENG form 4345. And once we receive a complete application, the core processing time, we shoot for 120 days. Some other key differences regarding the individual permits is that we are going to need adjacent property owner names and mailing addresses as part of notifying the public in the case of a standard permit for a public notice. And we'll also need help. So we usually, by the time a project comes to the core, you've already gone through your alternatives analysis to get to your preferred option. And so this is a little bit of like helping walk us back through what you've done so that we can document all the hard work you've done to reach the most minimally environmentally impacting option. That worked great. Thank you. So, core permit review process. Okay, so the yellow boxes are the aspects that fall under the responsibility of you, the applicant or the agent, whoever is acting for the applicant for the permit process. So I'll start at the top, the pre-application meeting or pre-app meeting. It's got a little asterisk indicating that it's optional, but this is such a great tool to get to talk to the core and start with the question of, do I need a permit? If I do, what does that process look like? Is this going to fit in a nationwide permit program, or does it have to be a type of individual permit? If the core is the lead federal agency and we're doing agency consultation, what kind of information do I need to provide the core in order to make that as seamless and efficient as possible? So that's really helpful. And in some cases, if your activity isn't regulated or you're not within waters of the US, then you may not need a permit and you're done. And so you can end in the green box over to the right. If you do need a permit, hopefully you've worked really closely with the core and gotten that optional pre-app meeting done. And so you know exactly what needs to go into your application. And so you go ahead and submit it. And if it is complete, then you can keep moving down. And if it's not, we'll work with you and hopefully get it complete as soon as possible. And then the core review shifts into interagency review. So our most common other federal laws that we evaluate and potentially consult on are Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act. So while that all is going on, I'll get back to this in a second. So many projects can be covered under, like if they fall under the nationwides, they can be covered under programmatic type concurrences for the water quality cert and CZM. But if they aren't covered, then the applicant's responsible for getting their individual coverage under each of those. So those are the two boxes on the far left in yellow. So that sort of is happening parallel, since the core can't make a final permit decision without some sort of concurrence from those two entities. So, and for the standard permits, there is a public notice review. And all of that ends with the core determination to either issue the permit or deny the permit. So when we're talking about activities, okay, so that yellow hemisphere, what activities are regulated by the core? So remember, structures or work in Section 10, those tidally influenced waters subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. So work can include dredging, the installation, replacement, retrofit of pipes and outfalls, like the one shown here with sort of the the duck bill valve, in, over, or under waters of the US. And here, not open trench, since that can involve like scooping out material and then replacing that. That might be a discharge of fill. And so that would also trigger 404, as well as some temporary structural construction BMPs. When we're talking about Section 404 impacts, so that's the discharge of fill into waters of the US in the context of, say, like stormwater activities. So that might include grading or grubbing, as well as some of that temporary, like for open trench installation of utility lines, maintaining infrastructure with rock or concrete, like covering up a pipe, or for those folks working on like roads and bridges, if you have some scour around the footer of your bridge, you need to support that. Some of that might involve a discharge of fill, stream or wetland restoration, like is pictured here, or some shoreline management, like a living shoreline or beach nourishment. So now shifting into the types of activities where a permit is not required. The three we'll cover here are activities in uplands, non-regulated activities, and exemptions. So some typical upland stormwater monitoring and management activities that happen in uplands and therefore don't require a core permit might include installing a weather station or monitoring equipment, installing a rain garden or permeable pavers, bioswales, rainwater harvesting, tree planting, or land preservation. Changing zoning doesn't necessarily result in a discharge of fill, and so there may be no core action. Non-regulated activities. So when we first talked about the two main core authorities, structures are only a regulated activity in tidally influenced waters of the US, meaning in non-tidal waters, it is not a regulated activity. You don't need a permit from the Corps. So that can include pipes, loggers, scaffolding, or weirs, unless they're cast in place concrete. And you'll notice in the figure on the right, that dotted line is for a non-tidal stream. That's the limit of the Corps' jurisdiction, shown as the ordinary high water mark. So just like structures regulated in Section 10, tidally influenced waters, not in non-tidal waters. Same thing for work. So when it comes to what we call one-step excavation with upland disposal, so this is removing accumulated sediment, doing a single scoop at a time and placing it directly into a contained area in uplands or directly into a truck. That's a type of work. So if this was in a tidally influenced water, it might need a permit. But if it's a non-tidal water, that's not a regulated activity, that doesn't require a core permit. Same thing regarding clearing vegetation or green waste or other debris, like following some sort of storm. If you've got a bunch of fallen trees, as long as you're not doing mechanized land clearing or grubbing to rip up the roots or grading, that also doesn't require a core permit. And again, the limits of the Corps' jurisdiction shown here on this non-tidal stream, the ordinary high water mark. So moving from uplands and non-regulated activities to permit exemptions. So under Section 404F of the Clean Water Act, the maintenance for a currently serviceable project of some kind can be exempt if there is exempt from Section 404 if there is no change to the character, size, or scope of the original fill design. So some examples like the one shown in this cartoon here is like following the 2018 rains in East Oahu. There were some concrete line channels where the panels were blown out. And so to replace that dislodged channel, as well as some fill behind it, that is replacing this structure, this originally authorized fill in the same character, size, and scope. Something to bear in mind. And so that exemption means that, and if it's in a non-tidal environment, if the only thing that would apply is Section 404, then no permit is required. Something to bear in mind regarding character is that can include the level of permeability. So let's say that you're doing bank stabilization in a non-tidal stream and you're replacing ungrouted riprap with grouted riprap. That's potentially going to change the permeability of that bank stabilization project. And so that might not be the same character. So it might not be exempt. That might require a core permit. There are other exemptions other than this maintenance one, specifically for farm or forestry roads and some ditches. So a few caveats to these exemptions. This is 404. This is under the Clean Water Act only. This doesn't apply in tidally influenced waters specific to work or structures. So let's say that I'm trying to think of an example. You have a rock revetment along a shoreline on a tidally influenced water like the ocean, and something happens and some of the rocks fall out and you want to put them back. So while the replacing the rocks wouldn't trigger 404 if you're restoring it to the same size, scope, and character, that could potentially be treated as work in a tidally influenced water. And so you might need a permit under Section 10. Also, the exemption, while it might cover the repair itself, it doesn't include fill for BMPs like a sandbag berm, which would require a core permit. So when we're talking about BMPs, I'll skip it down to the bottom of the page here. We would be looking at mulch or coconut fiber filled socks, sheet piles, or water filled forms as a type of structure. So that would only need a permit if it's located in a tidally influenced water that's subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. Versus gravel bags or sandbags, those would be treated as a discharge of fill, and that would probably need a permit in all waters of the US. Something else to bear in mind is that a natural stream channel is not a constructed structure or an original fill to be maintained. So stream clearing in a natural channel, that's why that needs a permit. Versus in a concrete line channel, the removal of that accumulated material is part of that 404F maintenance. So now shifting gears, this is a sort of update, at least in like the last 10 years, up until this most recent round of nationwides. All nationwides required reporting, meaning you had to submit your application, your PCN, pre-construction notification, to the Corps. We do our review following that flow chart and get to the end and make a decision. And then if we said, yes, this meets the nationwide terms and conditions, then we would issue a nationwide verification, issue a permit. So what's different, that's this sort of new concept here that's applied elsewhere in the US and now is being employed here, is non-reporting nationwide permits. So these are in that green section in the middle. It is a regulated activity. It's in waters of the US. Yes, it needs a permit. It's not exempt. But for certain activities, if you can meet, there's a higher bar if you can meet the nationwide, not only the nationwide terms and conditions, overall, the general, and the activity-specific conditions for non-reporting. So in some activities, there's one threshold for meeting the nationwides, and then another that's even more strict for meeting non-reporting. And your ESA effect determination from your team is no effect, so no consultations required. And your 106 NHPA effect determination is no potential to cause effect. Then you're covered under the nationwide permit program without that exchange with the Corps. You don't need to submit a pre-construction notification to us. You don't receive a verification letter in return. So something to consider, and something that we can talk about in a pre-app meeting. Another not quite as new, but still very exciting development is the Section 401 blanket. This is so great, you guys. So this, sort of like the nationwides for really common projects where we develop some sort of programmatic system to help provide coverage in a more efficient way. This is the same sort of concept for your Section 401 water quality cert. So if your project not only qualifies for most of the nationwides or letter of permission and meets the terms and conditions of this blanket water quality cert is sort of like your little accessory that comes with the core permit. So you apply for the core permit, and if you meet those other terms and conditions, it comes with the blanket water quality cert. You're covered. You don't have to separately seek your individual water quality cert. No need to contact Department of Health directly. So pretty exciting stuff. And so sort of wrapping up here, some keys to a good application so that we can move straight into the interagency coordination part and not have to circle back to ask for more information. So we really need a complete work description with your BMPs. We're not tied to a specific design percentage. We're looking more for the project footprint in square feet, or if it's massive, in acres. When it comes to your fill material volume, we're looking for cubic yards and about how long is your project going to occur, the construction going to take. So that's in your narrative description. When we're talking about project plans, we need the clear, for the most part, regulators tend not to be engineers. So if you're pointing at the plans and being like, clearly in this incredibly tiny font, can you not see this? I'm like, no, you need to take me with you and help simplify this to help tell the story of your project so that I can turn around and in interagency coordination, explain this to other non-engineers. So having your really clearly shown impact footprints where your project overlaps with waters of the US, as well as the limits of the waters of the US. So not just top of bank, because there may be a smaller amount of impact within that stream that may be below the ordinary high water marks, and that may affect whether the project qualifies for a nationwide permit, which is kind of a big deal. Other minimization efforts. Tell us about all the good work you've done before we even come into the core, because we want to give you credit and write it down in our decision documentation. When we're looking and coordinating with applicants, our process is to first look at, is it possible to avoid impacts of waters of the US because it's good for our program, trying to minimize environmental impacts, and it's good for you guys because one less permit to go through. Win-win. If we cannot avoid, then our next step is to look at minimizing. How can we make those impacts smaller? And for the most part, they end up as small enough that the next step requiring compensatory mitigation, for the most part, is not required. If it looks like it is going to be required, that tends to be part of the conversation that we have during a pre-application meeting. And then some of the project, we also need some of that project background info. So if you're doing a marine project, what's the substrate like? Full of coral? Is it all mud? Tell us more. Are there any historic properties nearby? Some more information about location of staging and stockpiling and access areas and uplands. It's not in waters of the US, and so it would be outside where we're permitting, but we still have to consider that if it's integrally related as part of agency consultation. And if you're doing work, if you're a private consultant doing work on behalf of a federal applicant, we need that documentation of whatever that federal applicant's completed consultation is, as well as if they made an effect determination like no effect for ESA, please include that rationale, because if there's just nothing there, then how do we know that somebody didn't have a brain fart and just completely forget to consult? We need to be able to support that decision not to consult in our documentation. We also need construction method, equipment, phasing, detours, and BMPs. As we talked about earlier, even if the project itself doesn't require a permit, let's say it's exempt, the BMPs themselves may require a permit. And BMPs can also affect what the project's formal effect determination is for ESA 106 and EFH. So the example that we're showing here, this is some pretty critical information. So we have the ordinary high water mark called out, showing the limits of the Corps' jurisdiction. We're showing where there's going to be some trees cut that can affect our ESA effect, ESA effect determination. They have some missing information here. We don't know how wide this roadway footprint is, and so we don't necessarily know what the impact to waters of the US is going to be. And here we're also showing a dotted line showing the turbidity curtain. That's an important BMP that we want to know about so that we can turn around and share that information as part of interagency coordination to demonstrate that your project would have more minimal impacts. Again, design percentage doesn't matter. We're happy to accept drawings where the dimensions are written in or drawn to scale. We just have to really understand what you're doing. So our nationwide application, our PCN, is located on the website here. And come talk to us. We're here to talk to. So you can submit your application or schedule a pre-app meeting by reaching out to us at this email, or ask if you've got a quick question, reach out to us over the phone. And that's it from me. Thanks so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Vera. So we're going to open up the Q&A session of our or the portion of our session today. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you the microphone so it can be recorded. And if you have any questions on our virtual platform, please put them in the Q&A section and we'll get to you as soon as we can.
Hi, Vera, this is Wayne Ishimoto. Yeah, I'm a construction inspector. We have a right now we have a project, yeah, that is in the harbor. So it's marine, yeah. One of the fishing vessels collided with the pile and damaged the pile. Okay, so now right now it's going through assessment and stuff like that, yeah. But how would you, does the BMP apply in that area? Like when I say that, like, how would the, you know, before they even start to the construction portion, you know, all those BMPs have to be set up. So like, what are the protocol that needs to be done?
So just to make sure I understand your question, Wayne, you're saying that there was a fishing boat that crashed into a pile and damaged the pile. And so you're interested in not just what is the permitting process for the pile repair, but also for the BMPs that go in place
Yeah,
to prepare in advance of that project. Is that right?
right, correct.
Okay. So I'm going to answer this based on the sort of initial information that we're having in this conversation. And I think for like an even more detailed answer, I would say reach out to us and we can have more of a pre-application consultation to kind of go through in more detail. But the short answer for this format, I would say, is if you're having fill BMPs, like because I don't know how deep this area is, but if you were to place some sort of sandbags to be able to, if you needed to work in the dry, sandbags and gravel bags are discharged as a fill and would require a core permit. Since it's tidally influenced, you would probably also need a permit for something like sheet piles that are reinforced, or even like water-filled forms, because that would be treated as a structure. Those, if it was just the BMPs, because sometimes it ends up being kind of like a phased project. So folks will want to, a sort of adjacent example would be if you have to install scientific monitoring equipment first, or do some sort of like boring survey first before you can do your actual project. We would probably keep the same number as far as our database to keep track of what's going on. But those types of, there are nationwide activities that would apply to those. So for for scientific monitoring devices, I believe it's a nationwide 5. Survey activities like borings, that's a nationwide 6. And so for minor fill, I can't remember if that's a nationwide 18 or 19. And then for structures, that might be like a nationwide 33, temporary construction access. But you don't have to worry about the specific type of nationwide. That's our worry. We just want to hear about the type of activity that you're trying to do, where you want to do it, and when. And we'll work with you to get the kind of detail that we need to keep our process moving. Hopefully that's a good start.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
well, thank you.
Thanks, Wayne.
For clarification on that, that's Pier 18, that's a Pier 18, the damage the in pile. We're gonna probably have to replace the entire pile, driving it 180 feet deep into the, down into the ground underneath the ocean there. So just for more clarification on that. And our EM department will be reaching out to you guys for permits and everything.
Great. Yeah, this is our main email address. Gets checked by our chief or whoever the acting chief is, and then that gets assigned to one of the regulatory staff. So we're here for it. Yeah.
I had a question about fill quantity determination, and I'll just use this project they were just talking about as an example. So if they removed that existing pile and they installed a new pile, and that pile was the same dimensions, same depth, Would the fill determination, would you use the volume of the new pile as your fill determination or the difference between the two?
So to make sure I understand the question, are we talking about, so you're talking about replacing a pile more or less in kind? And it sounds like you're asking about the 404F exemption as far as is it the same size, scope, and character? Is that what you're asking about?
I want the question to apply to other scenarios as well. So
Okay.
another scenario may be you have a structure that extends out, let's say a breakwater, and you're going to replace that breakwater, and the new breakwater is larger in footprint. And would the fill volume be determined by the difference between the two, or after you remove the existing structure and the entire new structure?
Okay, so we're talking about like work description. So the short answer is it would be the fill volume of the entire new structure, not the difference between the two. We would want to know about the difference because if it's a minor difference, then we might be able to have the project covered under one of the nationwide, say like nationwide 3. When it comes to, actually, I'm going to make this into a everybody here question. So let's take the example of the breakwater. Let's say I'm going to replace a breakwater in the exact same footprint, exact same size, scope, and character, and I'm putting my breakwater out in the ocean. Does that need a permit? I'm seeing some yes. Maybe seeing some no. Anybody brave? Want to tell me why that? So if it does need a permit, why does it need a permit? Absolutely. So section 10, tidally influenced body of water. Yep. So the 404 is the fill. So even if it's exempt under 404, if it's in tidally influenced water, that replacement could potentially be seen as a type of work. Yeah, great question. And thank you for being brave to shout that out. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions from some of our online attendees. The first one is, can a non-tidal stream be considered a navigable water?
Oh my gosh, such a good question. So for the most part, I would say here, not so much. So we've got the ocean, and then often the tidal influence continues some way up the stream. And just because of the topography we have here, usually around the time the tidal influence stops it also has already coincided with no more ability to be navigable. Elsewhere on the mainland, you have non-tidal rivers or sometimes other traditionally navigable non-tidal areas that are not currently navigable but were before. Like I can think of like the C&O Canal, where it's not tidally influenced, but it's still requires authorization under section 10. So if folks are dealing with this elsewhere on the US mainland, I would say maybe reach out to us and we can help you connect with the district and where your project would apply. Great question.
And then one more question. How many people work in the USACE Honolulu office?
Okay. So in the Honolulu District Regulatory Office right now, we have our chief. We have 2 staff in the Honolulu District office and our man in Guam. But we are in the process of hiring 4 more regulators to fill out the bench in the Honolulu office. So 3, but mighty. So we're still here and we're still committed to doing what we can to help you guys get through the process to continue to protect the environment and continue with sustainable development that we need to live our lives.
Thank you again, Vera. All right, that concludes this session, and that also includes the Department of Transportation's 2023 Protect Our Water Conference. Thank you all very much for attending. Please be sure to fill out the survey given out at the door at the end. And for those attending virtually, we will send you something through the Zoom events after the conference ends. As a reminder, speaker presentations will be available on demand until the end of December. The Zoom events on the Zoom events platform for virtual attendees. Please wait a few days for those sessions to get up there onto the platform. Then we will be posted to our Stormwater Hawaii YouTube channel after that. And presentations slides can be found at the Designers and Contractors tab of www.stormwaterhawaii.com for everyone to view. One last thing for everyone. Anyone who's completed and turned in their exhibitor stamp card, we actually just drew the two winners. They are Danny Yee and Brian Lee. So if you guys are here, please go to the registration lobby to receive your prize. If winners are not present, they will receive an email to set up for delivery of the prize. So again, thank you all for joining us on the Protect Our Water Conference, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. Mahalo.